Welcome to Season 2 of the Let's Talk podcast hosted by WellHouse Church, where we talk about what it's like to be a Christian Monday through Saturday, to be a person of faith in a culture against faith.
All right, so let's talk about the Tabernacle and the Temple, along with, like, the synagogues, and how all of this is developed from the time that I guess Judaism was regulated. We've been using this term recently. From the time that Judaism was like regulated around the time of the Exodus and the law was written, and where we get the tabernacle and how that goes through.
Yeah, regulation is a strange... I mean, it's fitting in some ways and oversimplified in others.
Correct.
Because what really brings about this concept of the tabernacle and the temple is twofold. God needed a place to dwell.
Mm-hmm.
That is what the tabernacle is as they are a nomadic people, God needed a place to dwell among them, to tabernacle among them. The Gospel of John, the prologue, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us.
Yeah.
The real reading of that, the real literal translation of that is, and the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. It is a place for God to dwell in the world, to exist in the world. Okay, if it is a place for God to dwell and exist in the world, then when you do that, the tabernacle begins as this place, and it has to be movable because they're moving. But when they get their permanent residence in Judea and Jerusalem, in the Promised Land, it's King David that first brings up the opportunity. And David says, Lord, how could I live in this palace when God has no house to dwell in? And that's when God has his famous line, you have too much blood on your hands. Instead of you building me a house, I will make you a house. The house of David, the throne will never not have your lineage on it. And Jesus comes through that line. Once again, and John says, to tabernacle among us. The tabernacle, temple, and synagogue actually originate as a place for God to dwell. That they are a place in which God dwells here on earth.
Sure.
Now, functionally, what do they actually end up being? A place where sacrifices are performed.
Sure.
The place where the liturgy is done, the place where the rules, regulations, requirements are performed. Part of that is because the earliest that we see someone build an altar and make a sacrifice is Abraham. Actually, I'm not sure that's true.
Well,
Noah may have built an altar.
I mean, I guess it was assumed that Cain and Abel would.
Oh, I guess you're right. I'm going to look this up real quick. Course, offering of the fruit, and Abel for his part brought. For Cain, his offering. Let's go out in the field. Yeah, maybe so. I guess it is assumed that they may have built an altar.
Because it is an offering to God.
It is. Well, and one is an animal offering and one is a burnt offering. Yeah, that's a fair point. And God, yeah. Genesis 8:20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord.
Yeah.
So yeah, we already have Levite law,
Right.
understandings of altars and sacrifice and burnt offerings and such. Those
Sure.
exist throughout Genesis.
Yeah.
And think about the famous story of Abraham and his son Isaac,
Mm-hmm.
where he is literally going to sacrifice Isaac, on an altar.
Mm-hmm.
That ends up being a primary purpose
Sure.
of the tabernacle and the temple, because in the Jewish view, blood must be shed.
Mm.
That the punishment for sin is bloodshed.
Yep.
And I think that is a beautiful metaphor that I still currently kind of operate off of in some ways for my own understandings of sin, is that sin are things that commit harm,
Mm-hmm.
which is bloodshed. Now, it's not the only way to commit harm.
Right.
But the truth remains the same, that sin is harmful.
Sure.
Sin is the things that are harming.
Sin creates experiences of death. Absolutely. But when you start getting this detailed about the tabernacle and the ways that you worship in/around it, you end up having to build your entire life around this thing, how you function in society, because now you have religious laws that are dictating how and when you do certain things.
Yeah,
Um,
it's true.
like not being able to, quote, work on Sunday, right? Or the seventh day, whatever day that is, the day of Sabbath. You now have an entire day where you can do nothing.
Yeah.
And you have to think about how that fits in the rest of your week.
Yeah.
So you have all of these things and all of these new things that are coming up that really change the society that they're living in the desert, in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
They have started trying to build these new norms since leaving Egypt. I guess they're working to find their own societal norms
Of course.
because they're coming out of a society where they were incredibly oppressed, and all they have are these few stories that they've probably heard from their granddads about these guys, like Abraham and Isaac,
And Jacob.
and so like they have these people, and they might have some idea about creation, or some version of it, but
Yeah, it's actually not clear how much of the story they have
Yeah.
before Genesis 12.
yeah, we're not real sure, but like they probably have some version of it.
They definitely have some version of the Noah story, because every ancient Near Eastern culture had some version of the Noah story.
Sure.
Every ancient Near Eastern culture has some flood ruining the known world.
Yep.
And the Bible one's not even the earliest one.
And they have the Job story.
No.
Wasn't it the earliest that was ever written down?
No. It's probably the earliest in actual time period if you were going to place it, because it predates Noah, because the dimension.
But it wasn't necessarily written. But so like
No.
they may not have it like written down anywhere, but also it's a story that's being told. Right?
Maybe in some ways, but at least they're definitely talking in those kind of terms.
Yeah, they're using this. I don't know. We don't know what they had, but now they have to build new laws off of it, and new social norms, and figure out how they're going to live with each other in the desert, traveling for 40 years.
Yep. And they start with 10.
Mm-hmm.
They start with 10 laws. And that is not enough.
No.
So much so that it's not enough right out of the gate. Moses can't so much come down from the mountain with those 10 laws before he arrives back down the mountain to them building an idol of a golden calf.
Yep.
And so Moses, in his anger, breaks those tablets, and we got to wait a little bit in the story to get some new ones.
For sure.
10 laws was not enough.
No.
And so they end up at 613. 613 laws in the Jewish Old Testament.
I actually didn't know that number. But you have all of this building like new social norms all around the tabernacle. That's why the tabernacle was so important. It moved everywhere with them, and their day-to-day life was centered around the tabernacle.
Yeah.
If you break one of these laws, you go to the tabernacle.
Yeah.
In some way, shape, or form. And there were common practices around it. And this thing also brought other social norms like Sabbath and things of that nature. And feasts, right? But now this ends up moving into the new tabernacle, the temple. David wants to build this thing. God says no. And ends up promising it to Solomon. So that's like an overview of the history.
Well,
But
and there's an expansion off of that because we haven't really talked about synagogues yet.
no. That's fair. Yeah, go ahead.
Synagogues don't arise until the temple is risen.
Mm-hmm.
Because what happens is the tabernacle moves around with a nomadic people that begins with about 30,000.
Right.
It's not that many people like when they come out of slavery in the Exodus story. And so when they come out, they have the tabernacle, and the tabernacle just moves around with them. So you don't need more than one.
Right.
But then when you replace the tabernacle with a temple,
Fixed
a
thing.
fixed location thing, and it's only in Jerusalem, the capital city. So each of these other regions and tribes, because right, there's 12 tribes
Sure.
of Israel. Each of these regions, tribes, villages, towns, cities, whatever, they need their own houses or places to worship God. Now, it's not where God is housed, but it is a place where you can worship God.
Right.
But they're not the temple because God is not housed there.
No, but what it does end up doing is creating a way for worship to be accessible to all people, all Jews and God-fearers, right? And when did we estimate that we got the first synagogue, the first expansion of the temple? Do we even know?
Well, David is 1,000. We can firmly say David's rule is in the year 1000 BC. So that would make Solomon 900 BC, give or take,
Okay.
maybe 950. So that's when the temple is built. Synagogue, I probably don't know when the first one is. They're definitely a common thing by Jesus' time.
Sure. Yeah. Somewhere in there, I guess.
Probably not until well after the post-exilic, because it's destroyed and they got to rebuild it.
Right.
It's the Ezra Nehemiah story. Yeah, my guess is going to be somewhere around 500 BC.
Okay. So somewhere around 500 BC to now, it seems like it's been important to God that worship for him is accessible.
Worshipping worshiping God, it is important throughout the biblical story that it be an accessible activity.
And I think that is perfectly exampled in the synagogues. Even though God may not be housed there in the pre Pentecost world,
Yeah,
right?
that's a great way to say it.
There was still a place to go and experience divinity.
Yeah.
Now in the post-Pentecost world, we have something a little bit different where the Spirit lives within us. We'll talk about all of that next week. But want to know another reason why Christians go to church, right, wrong, or indifferent? It's because there's churches on every block in America. It's accessible, like these synagogues. And I think something that makes it a little bit different is synagogues operated on a different sort of thing, I guess. I guess I don't understand how this would work. How would the synagogues operate within themselves?
What do you mean?
Get funds to do things? Did they need funds? Did the Jews that attended the synagogue?
Okay, so most of this information comes from the New Testament time. So I can
Okay.
answer that question, but I'm kind of encroaching into next week's episode, I think.
Okay.
And I got a follow-up story, which will be a great launching place into next week as a follow-up to this. But by the time of Paul, you had to have 6 Jewish men in a city in order to be eligible for a synagogue.
Right.
They're trying to establish base.
Oh, okay. So the Jewish men that established the synagogue end up running it themselves, I guess? Or like, yeah.
Well, think about Jesus' first sermon, right? He's in Luke chapter 4. He's in his hometown synagogue in Nazareth, where any Jewish man can get up and perform the liturgy.
So there's another aspect there. Now, I'm going to be very, very careful with this word, equality among voices, because it was Jewish man, not Jewish person. But the people that they thought could speak had the opportunity to speak.
Correct. And I do think this is another piece to your thing about accessibility, because I do think the synagogues make it accessible.
Sure.
Nazareth is only about 200 miles north of Jerusalem.
Right.
So it's not like, as far as treks go in the ancient world, it's really not that far of one. And there's a great story of Jesus, because remember, Passover and these festivals can only be performed in the holy city, in Jerusalem. They can't be performed at synagogues.
Yeah.
There's a famous story in the Bible where Jesus travels to Jerusalem to go to the temple for one of the festivals. And he makes a whip and turns some tables. Do you remember why, Clayton?
Because they were exchanging money in the temple. They required...
Add an increase, add a profit margin.
Essentially, they were requiring an entrance fee to the temple.
They are exploiting people for money. This is why Jesus says, "You've turned my Father's house into a den of thieves." They were excluding people from worship.
Yep.
They were not making worship accessible to people. And that is what we cannot do. Talking about the church, the history of the church, the development of the church.
Yeah.
That is what we cannot do.
And another point to why people don't go to church. I think that will be an important thing through the rest of this like little mini series, is like reminding, this is why people go to church. It is accessible. There's one on every corner. At least it feels like that in the Bible Belt.
Yeah.
Which in a way is a good thing if it were done properly. But because it's not done properly, and I'm not going to bombard you with all the reasons it's not done properly again and again.
We did that
and
last
again.
week.
Huh?
We did that last
We
week.
did that last week and the week before. And the week before that too, I think also.
And probably will next week.
And probably will next week. So I'm not going to hit you with all that again. But what I will say is once you get inside of it, it is not actually accessible to everyone sometimes. Which is why a lot of people don't go. But there is one everywhere because it is a big value of every Christian tradition to make it accessible for whatever your motivation is. Whether you say it is or what it actually is, it doesn't matter. Whatever the motivation is, there's a big value among Christendom to make it accessible. So yeah, that's why people go to church.
Thanks for listening to the Let's Talk podcast hosted by WellHouse Church. Be sure to give us a rating and a review if you enjoyed the episode. It's free and it helps us immensely. Also, feel free to check out our other podcasts.